I wanted to make a video on the 1/6 insurrection because we are so far from understanding the insurrection and why it occurred that we actually have to really dig into our government and how it is assembled and how it functions in order to understand that insurrection. It's not something that that we can just say, why did Trump and the big lie and all that stuff? That none of those things actually addresses the 1/6 insurrection and why it was possible to have that type of a incident in the United States in 2020. So we really have to dig into what the real problems that existed were, and even the big lie is supposed to be that Biden didn't win the election, that somehow the election was stolen from Trump. And the other side of the big lie is that this was the most safe and secure election in the United States history that was won by Biden. And that the insurrection was an effort to interrupt the certification of the election results being certified by Congress, which was a direct attempt to destabilize our democracy. I'll put it that way. Yeah, I just sighed. Because the reality is that none of that is factual. The reality is that the electoral process that we use today is 100% unconstitutional. It's not consistent with any part of the Constitution of the United States. So what we need to do is actually look at our democracy, what is our democracy, and how do we elect the president. And I won't get into what the roles and responsibilities of the president are today, because that's really not important right now. Even though I will touch on it when I talk about what a democracy is. Okay? So let's start with that, democracy. Today, our current understanding of democracy is it's based on three factors. One is free and fair elections to choose leaders and lawmakers. That's the first part. The second is this peaceful transfer of power, executive power. And the third is the rule of law. Okay? And if that sounds familiar, that is the three parts that they say constitutes the co-equal branches of government. The leaders go to the executive, the lawmakers go to the legislative, and then the judicial branch decides whether or not the laws that are made are constitutional. Okay? That's what they call democracy. And it has to have those three parts. So when we were downgraded in January of 2021 from a full democracy to a flawed democracy, I actually went and looked up what the criteria was for their assessment that we are no longer a full democracy and that we are a flawed democracy. And what I found by looking at their reports and their analysis was, first, that there is no accepted definition of democracy, which you would figure that by now we would have an accepted, universally accepted definition for what constituted a democracy. And two, that this idea of free and fair elections to choose leaders and lawmakers was the hinge point for what constitutes a democracy. So the people have to have free and fair elections to constitute a democracy. So if we think about that for a minute and actually think about what our free and fair elections are, which aren't free and fair at all, how they can be a democracy. Because when you have a partisan competitive election to choose your leaders and lawmakers, at least 50% of those who vote will not be represented. Okay? And those people who aren't part of the voting electorate and participate, their vote, they're not being represented at all. So when we actually look at the real definition of democracy, then what we call democracy does not fit that description. And what's the real definition of democracy? Well, you have to actually participate in a legislative process and reach a majority consensus for it to be a democracy. And as a democratic assembly, legislative assembly, you need a quorum requirement and a majority consensus requirement to operate the democracy, the assembly, and to come to a majority consensus, not of the people who participated in the assembly, but of all the people that are under that democracy. So that's the difference between a quorum and a majority consensus. Now, to discuss it in a meeting, in an assembly, to discuss it, you may only need 2/3 of the people in order to discuss it. Then, when you actually vote to reach a majority consensus, you need a majority of all the people, regardless of how many people are in the legislative assembly. So if you want to do them both in the same assembly, then if you have 2/3 of the people assembled to form the quorum to operate, then the number of those who are assembled who must vote in the affirmative is more along the lines of 75%, to where then you'll end up with 50% of all the people. Okay? That's democracy. You have to participate in the legislative assembly in order to reach a majority consensus of all the people. Okay? So if you're going to do that at the voting booth, then no matter how many people you have that are part of the voting electorate, which would be probably, in Colorado, we have a voting electorate of 67%. That's 2/3. So in order to operate our voting in an election as a legislative assembly, you need 100% participation. That means 100% of that voting electorate actually have to vote in order to form the quorum to operate. And then you would need a majority consensus of 75% to reach a majority consensus of all the people. Now, how many times have we actually done that in Colorado? Well, we had an election in the fall of 2019 where of our 67% registered electorate, we had a 34% turnout. That means only 34% of 67% voted. That is roughly around 24% of all the people. So they don't have enough participation in the voting to run the election as a legislative assembly. That means you can't make any decisions at all. You can't even discuss the topics because you don't have enough participation to discuss it. You don't have reached the quorum. And then by just over 50%, they passed one ballot initiative and they failed another ballot initiative. That means that One passed with 12% of the people. One failed with 12% of the people, which is not a majority consensus of the people. So they couldn't make those decisions and call it democracy because they didn't have a quorum to operate the system and they didn't have a majority consensus. So nothing they did can be made into law. So how do they get around these problems we have with being able to form a quorum and actually get a majority consensus of all the people? Well, that's where Republican government comes in. Because what you do is you form an exact representation of the population per capita. And in order to do that, you use a proportionality constant. So this is a math problem, more or less, which says how many representatives do you need to form an exact representation of the population, which is the same as the population, only smaller. And that's where you get into, like in Colorado, how many would we need? Well, if we did a representative density of one representative for every 10,000 people, then we would have a Congress of maybe 550 for our most numerous legislative branch. Okay? Why is that important? Because that process and the electorate which formed that most numerous legislative branch is how you qualify the electorate. And that's your qualified electorate. And both that process and the qualified electorate that was used to form the most numerous legislative branch must then be formalized in the Constitution for your state, which makes it unalterable. And why is that important? Well, because your federal legislative delegation for the most numerous legislative branch, which is the House, must use that same process and same qualified electorate. The only difference is the proportionality constant, instead of being 1 for 10,000, is 1 for 30,000. That's from the Constitution. Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3. Okay? And why is that important? Because when you elect the president, that's how many electors you're going to, each state is entitled, the whole number. So for Colorado, they would have been entitled to 169 members of the House, and then 167 from the House, 2 for their senators would mean that Colorado would have 169 electors, okay, to vote in the election, okay? But that's actually a misnomer because the electors aren't voting for a winner. they are only forming a list of qualified candidates for their state. So each elector gets 2 ballots. At least one of those 2 ballots, the elector has to choose a person from outside of their state. Okay? So they get 1 vote that they can vote for somebody inside their state, and at least one that they have to vote for somebody outside of their state. And that forms a list of people. So the electors really don't elect. The electors are the headhunter. Okay? That is providing a list of qualified candidates for the hiring manager, which is the union, which is the states. So when they compile that list, which is all the lists from all the states of all the names, which would have been 10,347 electors, each with 2 votes. So you had a possibility of 20,500 names on that list. In the first election, they had 69 electors. And they chose 12 different people. They had a list of 12 people on the list when it got to Congress. The state of Georgia, which had 5 electors, chose 5 different persons on their list. All the electors had George Washington as one of their choices, but the other ones chose 4 different people. Okay? They only had 5 electors. But that's their list. Then the lists are compiled in Congress. Okay? And from that list, the compiled list, the top 5 persons on that list are considered by the states who actually vote to choose the president. The states vote from the top 5 on the list. Okay? 1 vote per state. And a majority of the states is necessary to the choice. Okay? So if you look at that scenario, you realize quickly that there are no declared candidates because the electors don't have a list of candidates that they have to choose from. They are responsible for vetting and making their own selections for who they consider to be qualified and suitable for the office. They don't have to choose from a list, a prepared list. They are making the list from each state. And each state is entitled to make as many choices, twice as many choices as they have electors. So Colorado could have chosen 300 different persons with their electors. But they're not choosing there. They are only making a list and they rank the choices based on the number of votes that they got. Okay? By the electors. How many electors did they appear on their ballots? And why is that important? Because every state has to vote just as many, choose just as many people from outside of their state as they do from within their state. Okay? And in the case of George Washington, that ranked him number one on the list when it was compiled. He had 69, he was identified by 69 of the 69 electors. The second person on the list was Adams, and he was only identified on 34 ballots from the electors. Okay? So, because Washington was identified on all the choices, he not only had a majority of the electors because it was unanimous, he also had the most votes. So he was automatically elected. So say that Washington would not have wanted to be the president, which probably would have been the best scenario. And he would have said, no, I don't want to be the president. Then what would the states had to do? Well, since no one else had a majority, because Adams only had 34 votes, he needed 35 to have a majority of the electors. That would mean that the top 5 on the list, the next 5 on the list, would be considered by the states. So they would look at the qualifications of those people and try to make their case for why one should be president over another. And then the states would vote. 1 vote per state. And a majority of the states would be necessary to the choice. So that means that the person who would become president would have to have 8 votes because there were 13 states. And even the states that didn't ratify the Constitution in time to actually make a list, because there were only 10 states that actually transmitted a list of candidates because they ratified the Constitution in time to participate in the choosing part of in the identification phase of the election. But when they all gathered that next April or whatever, if they all could participate in choosing the president, and there were 13 states, and they're a union, so they had to have a majority of the states, period. They needed 2/3 of the states just to form a quorum to make to discuss it and to vote. But they needed a majority of the states as the union, which was 8. So if Adams would have become president, he would have needed the votes of 8 states to become president. And then the next person with the next highest vote would become vice president. Okay? Was that changed by the 12th Amendment of the Constitution? Well, no. The only thing they changed with the 12th Amendment was that the elector had to indicate on their 2 ballots which one they cast for president and which one they cast for vice president. So that means that their list that the state prepared had to indicate that the name of the person who got votes and for which office he got votes, because they could get votes for both offices because the electors did not have to agree that one would be presidential and the other would be vice presidential. Okay? So a person could get votes for both offices in the same election. So when they compile them in Congress, they have a list for president and they have a list for vice president. And then if no one gets a majority, then the top three for president are voted on, are considered and voted on by the states, and a majority is necessary to the choice. One vote per state in the House, but saying in the House doesn't mean anything because it's still the states voting. Okay? And then the top two for vice president would be considered in the Senate. That just means who's doing the discussing, because the senators are doing the discussing. In the House, the members of the House are doing the discussing. But the states are still doing it. They're discussing. And when they vote, they only get one vote per state. Okay? So that right there tells you that there are no declared candidates. There are no party nominations. There's no such thing as popular elections to assign a state's votes, electoral college votes, winner takes all. There are no tickets. The president and the vice president are separate always. They are identical, simultaneous elections. There's no ticket. They don't go together. They don't work together. Vice president don't work for the president. In fact, the president, in effect, works for the vice president because the vice president presides over the Union, the United States and Congress assembled. That's the vice president's job, is to preside over the president's boss. Okay? So the vice president doesn't work for the president. All right? But what does that mean to preside? That doesn't mean he makes decisions. He makes it possible for decisions to be made, collective decisions to be made. So he has to maintain order, which means that he has to make sure that the Congress is properly assembled and that they follow the proper legislative processes to reach a majority consensus. So he has all the authority over the rules, all the authority over everything that goes on in Congress. That's in the House and the Senate, because he's over the states, the United States and Congress assembled. And why is he over the Senate? Because the Senate is the most dominant and important legislative assembly, period. It is the democracy. Okay? Every state has equal representation and equal suffrage to reach a majority consensus of the states as the Union. That's a democracy. It's a discrete democracy because members only. Who are the members? The states. They're the members of the Union. That's a democracy. Okay? And the vice president's job is no more or less than to make sure that it's properly assembled and that it functions properly. That's his job. Okay? It's not to chase after the president and carry his bag. He has a more important job. And the president reports directly to the Senate. Okay? Directly. He's always under the direction and control of Congress, which is the United States and Congress assembled, the Union and the established government authority. So if we do this correctly, understand this, then we know that there never should have been an insurrection, because you can't interfere in the election process because of how it's designed. You can't win or lose an election. You can't even declare that you're a candidate. All those things and the requirements in the Constitution aren't so that you can run for president. It's to direct the electors' choices. They can only choose people to put on one of their